You are listening to Böll Europe, the podcast of the Heinrich-Böll-Stiftung European Union. In case you're joining us for the first time, we are the German Green Political Foundation affiliated with the German political party Allianz 90, the Greens. Our EU office represents the foundation vis-à-vis European and international institutions, associations, non-governmental organizations, and media based in Brussels. Today on the Böll Europe podcast, we discuss the role of healthy soils for climate mitigation and adaptation, biodiversity, and food production.
Dramatic new video into CNN shows devastating floods in Poland and several countries as heavy rains hit Central and Eastern Europe, causing some of the worst flooding in decades for that region. A massive, slow-moving storm dumped months' worth of rain onto several of Europe's historic capitals.
The worst flood to hit Europe in decades took hundreds of lives in the fall of 2024. Within a matter of hours, the water masses destroyed houses, streets, and infrastructure at an unprecedented scale.
The damage here is huge. Just look at what the force of the floodwaters has done to this railway line.
And that's not all. The storm also washed away valuable soils from fields, pastures, and parks. Precious layers of topsoil suffered extensive erosion in what turned out to be the flood of the century. This immensely valuable soil was washed into the rivers and, as a result, lost forever. On this one day in Central Europe, countless livelihoods were wiped out. With damages approaching the hundreds of billions of euros, the full extent of the European flood disaster has not yet become clear. Sealed and compacted soil is hardly able to absorb such a deluge of rain, so the effects worsen from one storm to the next, a vicious cycle that is nearly impossible to break, as critics are warning.
The dramatic events show us the crucial regulating function that intact soil has against the backdrop of an ever-accelerating climate crisis. But what are the climate challenges we face from increasingly depleted soil? And what role does soil play in the future of our planet? These are some of the questions we're going to explore in this podcast.
Soil Atlas 2024, a Böll Europe podcast by Peter Kreisler.
What kind of ground does our food grow from? What is the role of healthy soil, which is so critical for maintaining long-term soil fertility? We need healthy soil to ensure that high-quality food continues to be available in sufficient amounts and so that we can continue to experience natural diversity. Our soil also plays an essential role in the storage of water and CO2.
And thus play a key role in stabilizing the global climate. But will this remain the case in the future? Chemical inputs, however, such as fertilizers and pesticides, disrupt the long-term health of our soils, causing them to turn acidic and harming the microorganisms in the soil. Despite this, mineral fertilizers are increasingly being used in many parts of the world to achieve a short-term boost in crop yields.
But at what cost? And how sustainable is this?
Because artificial fertilizers also have a devastating effect on the climate. Their production requires enormous amounts of natural gas. Furthermore, nitrous oxide, which is extremely harmful to the climate, escapes into the atmosphere during the application of fertilizers. And despite the fact that artificial fertilizers have become extremely expensive due to high energy prices, they continue to be used on a large scale in the industrial agriculture sector.
So why then do we have such a high fertilizer dependence? Are there no alternatives to artificial fertilizers? The first episode of our podcast series on the Soil Atlas is about fertilizers and the fertilizer crisis.
Part 1. The Fertilizer Trap. In the United States in particular, we're seeing a massive use of artificial fertilizers. But in these times of crisis and record inflation, accompanied by volatile energy prices, we're realizing just how vulnerable our industrialized agricultural system has become and how dependent conventional farmers have become on artificial fertilizers. And we're realizing what the price of all of this is.
In the fall of 2023, I spoke to Scott, an American farmer in Ohio.
Warm weather too.
I'm a fifth-generation farmer. My son farms with me, and he's a sixth generation. And we farm about 1,900 acres, corn and soybeans.
Ain't very good, is it? So I said, let's just...
Every day, every week, things just keep going up. My nitrogen price was $50 an acre a year ago. Now it's $150, and if I would have pre-purchased it, it'd have been more like $250 per acre just in nitrogen prices.
Farmer Scott describes how much he's at the mercy of the price of artificial fertilizers. If it weren't for the artificial inputs, such as pesticides and artificial fertilizers, yields in Ohio would collapse.
Compost and natural fertilizers are virtually unused in this highly industrialized agricultural system, where thousands of hectares are farmed by just 2 farmers.
Fertilizer is the most important ingredient determining yield for farmers, perhaps behind water. So demand is robust, but production is uncertain. And that's what the market is trying to price globally. I hope we're going to see some relaxation of fertilizer prices.
Here on the vast fields spread across thousands and thousands of hectares, farming has become highly industrialized. With only his son to help, the farmer cultivates these huge areas of land. Now all he can do is pray that prices will stabilize again in the fall of 2023. If they don't, the continued existence of the farm is in jeopardy.
Scott, whose family has been farming the land for 5 generations, will be out of business. The extremely profitable business of artificial fertilizers is now reaching the limits of growth, so it's no surprise that the artificial fertilizer industry is looking for new markets.
Africa is the last major growth market for artificial fertilizers. In Kenya, African Union leaders met at the Africa Fertilizer and Soil Health Summit. Here, political decision-makers tout the blessings of artificial fertilizers. In many places on the continent, the soil is already depleted and heavily affected by erosion. But is the use of artificial fertilizers the right way to remedy the problem?
The use of artificial fertilizers is set to triple by 2034, according to the final declaration of the conference. Harun Varui is program lead for agroecology and food rights at Heinrich-Böll Foundation in Nairobi, Kenya, and he is highly skeptical of such decisions.
Yes, I strongly feel that there was heavy push on fertilizer from the industry, with less focus on sustainable farm practices that will enrich our soils and make it sustainable in terms of supplying the relevant macro and micronutrients. And more, the dominance of industry was felt, and that still the synthetic fertilizer as a means of enhancing our food productivity, I would say that that still remained the focus. But it's unfortunate, of course, as you know very well, that the long-term dependency on the fertilizers, the synthetic fertilizer, is not the main focus when it comes to enhancing our soils. One thing we need to appreciate is that over-dependency on fertilizer, of course, makes our soils acidic, and this depletes the essential microbiology in the soil. And these microbes are important for providing the essential nutrients and environment for symbiotic relationship within the soil. However, we realize that countries that have overused fertilizer, Zambia, Kenya, and in fact, compared to countries like Uganda, these countries have not increasingly got corresponding higher yields from their land.
Perhaps he can give an example of how big the difference is.
Example is that in Kenya, where we are applying 57 kilograms of fertilizer per hectare, Kenya continues to produce less grain, both wheat and maize per hectare compared to Uganda, but mainly maize when you compare Uganda and Kenya. Where Uganda, they use about 2 kilograms per acre, Kenya, we're using around 57 kilograms per acre. And yes, our production is less compared to Uganda. So meaning that the soils of Uganda are healthier compared to Kenya.
But what could the solutions look like?
I want to give you an example of farmers that have interacted in a place called Rumuruti, that is around Mount Kenya region. They are now trying to avoid overutilization of their soil for tomato production, and they are incorporating practices like planting of sunflower to break the annual growth of tomatoes on that land. So they will break that, then they will do legumes, they'll do beans, and then go back to tomatoes. So that kind of crop rotation is now picking up. Sure, personally, like me in my farm, I'd have some few livestock, and I compost manure from these animals. And this is becoming a testament even from my neighbors. They ask, oh, we can see you are not using synthetic fertilizer. What's happening in your farm? You have got, even when there's a dry spell, you don't miss to harvest something. Your crops are not affected by the dry spell.
Experience from the United States clearly demonstrates how reliant modern agriculture has become on the fertilizer industry. Are we now repeating the same mistakes in Africa?
I speak to Gideon Tubbs, a scientist who spent years studying the issue of fertilizers. Tubbs is a researcher at the University of Cologne. What are we to make of the promises that the fertilizer industry is making for Africa? Will artificial fertilizers save us from famine in the future?
I think there's no straightforward relationship just between increasing the availability and accessibility of fertilizer and decreasing the numbers of people basically going to bed hungry. I think it's not that easy, of course, because hunger is obviously to some extent an issue that is caused by multiple variables. Yeah, so it is about crises, it is about conflicts, it is about also inequalities in between households and so on. And it is, of course, not one single solution to just increase fertilizer availability. However, it is, of course, reasonable to also deal with the, I would say, structural problem of having too little nutrients on African soils, on African farms, in order to increase production, preferably in a sustainable manner.
When they hear fertilizer, many people initially think of their garden or of plants on their balcony. Give the plants some fertilizer and it'll help them grow. What harm could it do to give the plants more nutrients, you might think? At the beginning of the agricultural industrial revolution in England, massive increases in harvest yields were achieved even without the use of artificial fertilizers, through the cultivation of clover and the use of manure, among other things. It's only in the last century that we've started seeing the large-scale use of synthetic fertilizers.
So how then have we become so highly dependent on artificial or synthetic fertilizers?
Looking at the world's food system's dependency on fertilizer, that is, that half of the food we produce, eat, but even waste also, relies on nitrogen fertilizer application, I think we can actually talk about what I would say is a revolution in fertilizer use since the Second World War, at least. So, in other words, since then we have seen this massive increase on a global level of fertilizers being applied, which means that we've seen an average growth, that is the mean growth, from less than 20 kilograms of nutrients per hectare to about 130 kilograms approximately today. So we can now wonder about the reasons for that, and if we look at it again from this historical point of view, then it is clear that after the Second World War, there was basically a very, very large amount of production capacity idling basically around that had been previously needed for the production of explosives, so not fertilizer per se, or to put it more blunt, even bombs, weaponry that was needed for the war machine, if you want to say so. So after the Second World War, of course, also some of this idling capacity was then converted to some extent, civilized into other use cases. among them was mainly fertilizer. And that was what was basically making it possible to have such a revolution of fertilizer use at first hand back then.
A six-fold increase in the amount of fertilizer applied within just a century already amounts to rapid growth. But now, the fertilization of farmland is bringing the planet to its limits. That's according to fertilizer scientist Tubbs.
Well, again, historically, the growing uptake of fertilizer certainly has been a main driver of increasing yields, on a global average level. But we have to be very careful here about just talking about this global mean. We also have to look at the regional specificities of it, So this productivity growth and the limits of it have certainly taken place in the global north, in the US, in Europe, to some extent South Asia, and recently also Latin America. But we've seen, especially in these, let's say, front-runner regions, that we've actually reached these limits that are so dreaded, meaning that you basically can no longer apply more fertilizer and drive yield increases because we are at the physical maximum. We've even exceeded that maximum, which then means we have so much nutrients losses, harming the environment and so on. So yes, in many regions we are certainly at the limits to this module, and we can no longer increase fertilizer use here at a reasonable level and at a sustainable level especially.
But that would mean that the fertilizer industry has reached the limits of growth.
Of course, yes, that's very true. And especially the northern fertilizer industry has actually indeed experienced this slowly incoming phase of stagnation, because the end markets were basically perfectly conquered. There was no more market to be taken here in the north because actually regulation and so on due to environmental issues even meant fertilizer decreases in terms of use. Also technological innovation demanding less fertilizer use on the fields has basically challenged their core business, that is converting fossil fuels to fertilizers and then selling it to the farmers. Yes, we've certainly in these regions, in these front-runner regions, the industry has reached its sort of bottleneck, which doesn't mean it does not apply to other regions. Of course, there are other regions, especially the African continent, which are still shaped by, actually underuse of fertilizer, also from an economic point of view, and that is then, of course, the market of the future for the industry, and actually a very difficult market for the industry.
Some experts argue that when it comes to the global distribution of nitrogen surpluses, the global north should use less fertilizers and more should be used in Africa, where in many regions the soils are much more nutrient poor.
But there is significant resistance to using less fertilizer here in the global north. What are the farmers' reactions to this idea?
Managing nitrogen especially is, of course, an extremely delicate task, because for farmers it has long been a very, let's say, easy and comforting solution to simply, if I may say so, to simply over-fertilize their farms. Fertilizer was relatively cheap, widely available, and so on. And as long as something grows from it, you'll make a profit, And now, especially in the global north, you have more and more regulations coming in, scrutinizing the practices of farmers on the field, scrutinizing also to some extent, of course, the industry and its impact on climate change and so on. And that is, to some extent, unsettling the whole business model, if not the whole value chain. So, viral protest from farmers is, of course, also related to our attempts of managing nutrients more sustainably today.
But we're talking about a climate-neutral future here. How do we plan to achieve that in the fertilizer sector?
Yeah, it's of course a huge topic in the industry because it's very clear that according to the Paris Agreement and so on, the fertilizer industry must be looked at very critically, and the fertilizer industry must transform structurally. Yeah, it can no longer go the easy way of burning fossil fuels, converting them into fertilizers, and that's why there's currently such attention around decarbonizing fertilizer production, first of all. So the whole scientific community, politicians, and of course the industry itself is exploring ways to drastically reduce emissions from production and to some extent from transport, although there's little to gain. So that is clearly shaking up the industry today.
And that has existential consequences for this industry, because where is the next market supposed to be? And that's where the African continent comes into play. For the fertilizer industry, this would be the last market on the planet that still holds great potential for growth. And according to Tubbs, this is in fact where fertilizer companies are currently circling, with an eye to developing this promising market.
So especially in Africa, sub-Saharan Africa, the story is, of course, a different one. Yeah, so that is the typical struggle here.
18 years ago was the declaration of the Green Revolution, also for Africa. The aim was to increase the harvest yields on Africa's largely barren soils. So far, however, increases in yield have been slow to materialize. The German government also invested large amounts of money in this area. Critical voices point out that Africa is at risk of repeating the same mistakes that we made in the global north, without achieving any significant increases in harvest yields.
After all, the increases in crop production that were achieved in Asia, the US, Europe, and South America are not simply transferable to Africa. By now, people have become accustomed to high crop yields. They take them far too much for granted and are now surprised that there's stagnation.
According to a study entitled The Fertilizer Trap, 9 of the biggest fertilizer companies were projected to make a profit of over $84 million in the years 2021 and 2022. In 2022 alone, companies made $57 billion in profit, more than 4 times their profit in 2020. It's been the farmers and governments that have footed the bill. The report found that in 2021 and 2022, G20 governments and farms will have to pay $21.8 billion more for fertilizer imports, almost 3 times what they paid in 2020. These exploding costs are leading not only to protests by farmers around the world, from Pakistan to Ethiopia to Ecuador, they are also linked to a dramatic increase in food prices and to food insecurity in some countries. This is one of the findings of the study The Fertilizer Trap, published in November 2023 by the Institute for Agriculture and Trade Policy.
Hey, hi, here you are. Hi, how are you doing? Good.
My name is Lena Luig. I work for the Heinrich-Böll Foundation, and I'm heading the International Agricultural Policy team here in Berlin.
Everyone needs fertilizers in order to harvest food. That's what we're told. Now, as we find out, Africa too is falling into new dependence on fertilizers. What are we to make of the stories of yet more increases in production, or even record harvests, that the lobbyists for the fertilizer industry are so eager to share?
So the industry basically tells us that in order to feed a growing global population, we need more fertilizer. Like, we need to produce more food, and for this we need more fertilizer to increase the productivity. But of course, this is very problematic because synthetic fertilizer has different problems related to it: environmental problems, climate problems, and also geopolitical dependencies. So that's very tricky. And we also know that there are other ways to or other important issues to look at when we talk about how to feed the world, which is, for example, food prices. It's most people that are hungry because they're poor, and if the food prices go up, people will not be able to eat what they need, basically. And there it's really interesting to see that increasing fertilizer prices also have an impact on increasing food prices. So yeah, it's really better to get out of the dependency of fossil fertilizers.
Lena Luig is an expert on international agricultural policy at the Heinrich-Böll Foundation and was project manager for the new Soil Atlas. According to the young agricultural expert, artificial fertilizers represent a previously underestimated danger. In times of depleted soils, the ecological cost of nitrogen fertilizers is simply too high. What are the problems associated with artificial fertilizers and mineral fertilizers?
There are several problems related to the use of synthetic fertilizer or mineral fertilizer. There are different names. One is environmental problems related to the use of synthetic fertilizer. So we have different types of fertilizer. In the case of nitrogen fertilizer, this refers to nitrogen contamination in groundwater, for example. If we have an excess use of nitrogen fertilizer, there are also so-called algal blooms in freshwater or oceans. You might have heard of that. So this is a really big problem if we use too much nitrogen fertilizer. But there are also other types of fertilizer, such as phosphorus fertilizer, which has a mineral basis, an extractive basis, basically. So you need to mine phosphorus, and this usually happens also sometimes in conflict areas like Morocco and Western Sahara. And this is also a whole geopolitical, apart from the environmental issue, this is also a whole geopolitical issue. And then we have the climate aspect.
So what are the numbers in terms of climate damage? What role does fertilizer play in that context?
So for the production of nitrogen synthetic fertilizer, you need a lot of gas because it's this so-called Haber-Bosch process that was developed in the beginning of the 20th century with two Germans. Chemically speaking, it's the ammonia synthesis. And for this process, to create urea, which is the basis for nitrogen fertilizer, you need very high temperatures and high pressure. So this consumes a lot of energy, and this is mainly gas. And because of this very high energy demand of nitrogen fertilizer production, the scientific study found out that in 2018, the global supply chain of nitrogen fertilizer was responsible for more than 2% of global greenhouse gas emissions. So this might seem little, but of course, if it's only this one product, and it's the whole life cycle. So it's a production and also the use on the field, because this is the other side of the coin.
But there are other impacts as well. For instance, greenhouse gas emissions. Just how dangerous is that?
If you apply too much nitrogen fertilizer on the field and the soil doesn't absorb, or the plant doesn't absorb the whole amount of nitrogen, the rest that isn't absorbed by the soil or the plant is emitted as nitrous oxide. And nitrous oxide has 300 times more greenhouse gas potential for climate warming than CO2. So it's a huge climate impact, really, and it all goes down to synthetic nitrogen fertilizer.
Then why do we continue to use so much nitrogen fertilizer?
On the one hand, it used to be cheap to produce it, and it was a very attractive model in the 20th century to raise food production. Also, after 2 world wars, it sort of made sense to say, okay, we need to produce more food because we really had a very low food production, especially in Europe, to increase that and then export it to other regions of the world, this model. But now it's really also this very strong lobby of fertilizer companies that tries to stay on this level of high fertilizer use, of course, and in the markets where they cannot increase their sales anymore, they try to go to other markets, expand their market, basically for African continent, for example.
While organic farming does without synthetic fertilizers entirely, conventional farmers often use significant amounts of nitrogen fertilizer in order to increase the protein content of the wheat and hay, for example. When it comes to wheat, the fields are fertilized with nitrogen one more time just before harvest in order to boost the protein content of the flour. A higher protein or gluten content in wheat ensures that industrial bakeries can more easily process the flour. Ultimately, it's the protein content in the wheat that determines what price the farmer gets for his wheat. But large numbers of farmers have been forced to pay exorbitant amounts of money for fertilizers that keep going up in price. Between September 2021 and September 2022, the price of nitrogen fertilizer in Europe increased by 149%. But the companies are most likely exerting a lot of pressure to keep the industry from stagnating and to ensure continuing growth.
In the first months of the war, the industry was referring to a fertilizer crisis. When you first hear that word crisis, it sounds like we're talking about a significant drop in revenue and about losses. But just what do those numbers say?
This fertilizer lobby is really strong, and what's crazy is that they were also one of the main crisis profiteers when energy prices soared in 2022 after the Russian invasion in Ukraine. So there was a study that said that in 2022, the largest 9 fertilizer companies made record profits, like a profit margin of 36% per average. So that's really huge, like a third basically of your sales, it's pure profits. And this was because energy prices were high, but they could pass this high energy price on to the fertilizer price. So fertilizer prices really soared, and the fertilizer companies were the ones who profited the most.
But Lena Luig points out that this is what's referred to as windfall profit. After all, no one could have foreseen Russia's war of aggression against Ukraine. Nevertheless, it's still worth taking a nuanced look at the inflation situation.
Who were the losers? And who ultimately benefited from the massive increase in food prices in recent months? Were the price increases really passed on in a proportionate way? In the end, it was the Global South that suffered most under the price explosion for artificial fertilizers. Fertilizer prices doubled in Nigeria, tripled in Ethiopia, and almost quadrupled in Zimbabwe between early 2022 and early 2023, according to a study by the NGO ActionAid.
A lot of farmers couldn't cope with the high fertilizer prices. Many that could started using more manure instead of artificial fertilizers, while others had to incur huge losses. But European fertilizer producers were also impacted by the high gas prices, as illustrated in this report from February 2023.
Spiraling gas prices have caused a decline in European ammonia production, thereby aggravating the shortage of fertilizers in Europe. CRU Group analysts estimate that around half of European ammonia production plants and 33% of nitrogen fertilizer plants have closed down as a result.
In the wake of the fertilizer crisis, it became increasingly difficult for German fertilizer producers to stay competitive, because there was one country that was more than happy to sell its gas-produced nitrogen fertilizer in Europe, namely Russia. And in Africa too, Russia began to use its artificial fertilizers for geostrategic purposes, strengthening its alliances on the African continent through the fertilizer trade.
Amid global fertilizer shortages and rising prices since 2020 aggravated by the Russia-Ukraine war, the Russian chemicals company Uralchem-Uralkali last year agreed to donate 260,000 tons of fertilizer to African countries most at risk of food insecurity.
In a cafe in Berlin, I meet Lisa Tostado, who works for Ciel, the Center for International Environmental Law. The environmental scientist lives and works in Paris. I ask her about the impacts of the fertilizer crisis.
So when the full-scale invasion of Ukraine happened, there was a lot of panic with regards to the gas dependency of Europe on Russian imports. So gas prices absolutely soared because partly gas was sanctioned and partly pipelines were actually put out of, were not functioning any longer. So we had a very sudden supply shock and therefore a very high price spike. And as so much of the costs of fertilizers are based on fossil gas, the fertilizer industry in Europe was not competitive any longer and actually had some production curtailment. So we started importing more fertilizers from elsewhere. And what's most concerning is that we did sanction gas from Russia, but we never sanctioned fertilizers, even though, as I said earlier on, fertilizers are basically fossil gas in another form. So we started importing even more Russian fertilizers than before. So since the full-scale invasion, the urea exports, so that's the most important nitrogen fertilizers, from Russia have doubled. And they now account for about 1/3 of EU's total imports. So it's a very dangerous new dependency that we are walking into, or that we are already basically in. And we also transfer money to the Russian regime because of this dependency on fertilizers. It is estimated that yearly it's about 1.5 billion euros that we pay to Russia for the fertilizers. And in addition to that, Russia has also introduced a 10% export tax on fertilizers and a tax on excess profits of fertilizer companies. So both of these things are also directly funding the occupying forces, basically. So that's very bad news with regards to geopolitical dependencies, but also with regards to the climate, because the production in Russia is more greenhouse gas emissions intensive than production in Europe.
Have the environmentally harmful effects of artificial fertilizers been sufficiently recognized, or are they still being overlooked?
There's indeed an underestimated climate impact from our overuse of synthetic nitrogen fertilizers. As you mentioned, the greenhouse gas effect, generally speaking, is about the same or a little bit higher than commercial aviation. And a lot of people speak about like what we call in German Flugscham, so that it's like people understand that commercial aviation is a very harmful sector, but nobody talks about the fertilizer and climate nexus.
In the current climate debate, the issue of CO2 has been very much at the forefront, and a full day of the UN Climate Summit in Dubai was also dedicated to the topic of methane. On the other hand, the public at large is still relatively unfamiliar with nitrogen, or laughing gas.
So why are they so damaging to the global climate? Well, we have emissions all along the entire life cycle of fertilizers, starting with their production. Because they're fossil-based, we have emissions that arise from the extraction of the fossil fuels to the processing, all the way to the production facility. It is a very greenhouse gas emissions intensive process to synthesize ammonia. So about 40% of the emissions that are associated with fertilizer use arise in that production stage. But then 60%, so even more of the emissions, are associated with the use stage of fertilizers. So once we apply them on our fields, because only a small fraction of the nitrogen that we apply to crops is actually taken up by them, as we apply so much. And that leads to all sorts of problems, most notably when we talk about the climate, to nitrous oxide emissions. So that's what we generally know as laughing gas.
But now the industry naturally wants to keep selling its fertilizer in the future as well, and that's understandable. And apparently they have some quite interesting solutions and sustainable innovations up their sleeves.
So one solution that the industry promotes is called carbon capture and storage, or short CCS. So what they're suggesting is that they still use fossil fuels to produce the fertilizers, but instead of emitting the emissions during the process, which is happening right now, they suggest to capture at least some of the emissions and then store them somewhere underground, which sounds kind of nice on paper at first sight. But unfortunately, this method has already a quite long history of under-delivering and over-promising. The capture rates have never really been reached, so we still have lots of emissions that go unaccounted for. We don't really have a good solution for a long-term storage of these emissions. There's lots of problems associated with pilot projects so far. They do not address all the methane emissions, which are also a very big climate problem that arise before the fertilizer production facility. All the methane emissions that are associated with the extraction of gas, the transport of gas, there's all these leakages, and carbon capture and storage equipment would not change these emissions either.
What are the green solutions that the fertilizer industry is putting forward? Lately, CCS and blue and green hydrogen have become quite the buzzwords. Millions of euros in investment and government funding are going towards the development of these technologies.
And in addition, you need extra energy to run the equipment to capture emissions, to have CO2 pipelines, to inject that with high pressures underground. So this is all just the numbers do not add up, unfortunately. It is not a climate solution. And in addition to that, it is very expensive also. So that is just not a very good solution. It is a very wasteful way of spending public and private money. A better solution would be to not use fossil fuels in the first place.
In your opinion, is it smart to invest in this sector, whether in the private or public sector?
We at Ciel do not think that any subsidies for carbon capture and storage are a wise use of public money or private money, for that matter. It is a very ineffective and very expensive alleged climate solution. So what we're seeing right now in Europe, for example, there is a project in the Netherlands. It is the biggest ammonia facility in Europe. So they produce nitrogen fertilizer, first and foremost. And they want to capture some of their CO2 emissions, then liquefy that gas, put it on specialized CO2 vessels, and then ship it from the Netherlands all the way up to Norway for about over 1,000 kilometers, and then inject it into the seabed in the North Sea there. And that is a very energy-intensive process to do this all. We do not have certainty that the CO2, once injected, actually remains there. We would have to monitor that for basically millennia.
The whole thing sounds a bit like a parlor trick. In other words, these are pseudo-solutions for reducing CO2 emissions that don't really work, at least not yet. What would better solutions look like, in your opinion? After all, the past decades have seen us become very dependent on artificial fertilizers in this increasingly industrialized agricultural system of ours. And obviously, it's going to be very difficult to finally break with all of this.
It is true that a lot of agricultural production today in our industrial food system is based on these external inputs. However, that doesn't mean that 50% of the world population is actually fed thanks to fertilizers. This is just the crops that we can actually grow, and a lot of that go into feeding animals, they go to waste, they go to biofuel production, etc. So these are levers that could actually reduce our need for fertilizers without impacting how many calories people can actually directly eat. There was a recent study that found that only 15 to 5% of the nitrogen that is applied onto fields actually makes it into human stomachs as food. Everything else is lost along the supply chain or used for other use cases than direct human consumption. So that is a very big lever. I do realize that politically it's a sensitive and kind of a hot potato, but it is absolutely key to talk about these things because they do not only have a climate benefit, but also health benefits, especially in Europe or North America, where generally speaking, the average diet is way too high in red meat intake, for example, and it is not good for us, even from a health perspective.
How to find a way out of the fertilizer crisis by increasing the health of our soils. That will be the topic of episode 2 in our podcast series on the 2024 Soil Atlas.
Thanks so much for joining us on this first episode of the Böll-Europe podcast, and a huge thank you to all of our guests. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe, and you can always leave us a review or your comments. You should also check out the web dossier of the Soil Atlas on our website. Just go to eu.böll.org/en/soilatlas. You can find the link and lots more information in the show notes. We hope you join us again for our next episode. Our author is Peter Kreisler. Production was done by Monobeat. Our editor was Lena Luig. Narration by Mariana Evenstein and Warner Poland. All the translations were done by Peter Rigney. And our music is by Zoe Keating.